Christian parenting.
This is Cynthia Yanoff, and you're listening to Pardon the Mess. Each week we have honest discussions about the ups and downs of parenting and the lessons God is teaching us along the way. It's real, it's fun, and it's biblical. Life is messy. Don't walk the parenting road alone. Hey guys, welcome to Pardon the Mess. I am glad that you're with us today. We are going to take the next couple of weeks and devote them to hard conversations we need to have with our kids. And today we have with us licensed counselor Sissy Goff. She's from Nashville. She's been on our show before and she loves the Lord. She speaks into all emotional health issues related to our kids, adolescents, especially with girls. But today we're talking about anxiety. And she's going to tell us how before the pandemic, 1 in 4 of our kids would struggle with anxiety. And since the pandemic, it's 1 in 3. And girls are twice as likely than boys to be dealing with this. And so I'm glad she's with us today as she gives us some strategies that we can use at home, some conversations to have, conversation starters, also some things that we do with our kids that are not helpful when it comes to anxiety. I personally had a complete indictment on me when it comes to that. She talks about not trying to fix it for them, which I'm guilty over here. She also speaks into other mental health issues like eating disorders. There's just a lot to this. And so I'm thankful you're here. I'm thankful we're willing to have some of the hard conversations with our kids because they deserve it. And we've got to stay in the game with them as we're parenting them. So here we go today with Sissy Goff. Hey, Sissy, welcome to Pardon the Mess, or welcome back to Pardon the Mess, I should say. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so glad to be back with you. I still think about some of the things you said on the last podcast.
I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with that. When you say that and you're an unbelievable, one of the most respected counselors, and then some things I've said, speaking of parenting, are still with you years later, I don't know what to do with that.
You said I wish I had the exact phrase you said, but I quoted it so many times afterward, but it was we were talking last time, I think in the beginning of the pandemic. And there was something that you talked about basically kind of God is going to make beauty out of this mess. Somehow.
Yeah.
And I can't remember exactly how you said it, or he's growing good things in the midst of it, but it stayed with me.
Yeah, well, sounded really lovely back at the beginning of the pandemic. You should have called about 6 months later. I was shaking my fist at the heavens, but it's fine, Sissy. We're all fine over here. I'm kidding.
It's hilarious.
I'm excited that you're here because we are talking this month about brave conversations to have with our kids. And so you have this new book out that is unbelievable, Brave, a teen girl's guide to beating worry and anxiety. And I think it's amazing, obviously, for girls. I think it's amazing for us to talk about anxiety with boys too. So whatever you're raising, whoever's listening to this, Sissy's got a word for you today. And, I think I wanted to dig in just before we start. Could you tell me a little bit about Brave? Because I think that's such a great title. But why Brave with anxiety?
Because I think that's one of the things anxiety robs any of us, not just kids, not just girls, but any of us, is that sense of courage and that sense of, I really can do this thing, whatever the thing is in front of me. And I'm seeing it really pre-pandemic. I was seeing it with adolescent girls, but since it started, it's gotten so much worse. And so that was really why I chose the name Brave.
Yeah. And, I think the other thing is I almost feel like sometimes you have to disarm parents a little bit when you start speaking into anxiety. Or again, maybe it's me, Sissy. Sometimes it comes back to my own issues. But I just feel like sometimes we have this mom guilt, dad guilt going on. And I even read in your book, it said if you struggle with anxiety, you, as a parent, you are 7 times more likely to have a child that struggles with it. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, exactly.
Okay. So one, I think we've got to be brave and recognize it in ourselves. And I think most of us probably know or have a sense if we're dealing with anxiety. But then how do we dig in and what do we need to be careful about as raising our kids when we know that we've had it, we feel guilty about that with our kids, or do we tend to ignore it? Just how does that play out between parent and child?
Well, I would say if you're listening as a parent, I don't want you to feel any guilt. Because I think there is such a genetic piece of this. And, you're younger than I am, Cynthia, but I mean, we are still, I think, growing up as a generation of grown-up kids who our parents weren't in counseling and no one was talking about anything on an emotional basis. Or if they were,
Yeah.
you were in the small minority, and amazing that you had parents who were doing that. But that wasn't the reality for so many of us. And so we weren't in counseling as kids. And so I think we're probably really late to the game of even understanding what's going on inside of us. And I still sit with a lot of parents, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this, but when you're with someone who's really anxious, it's almost palpable in the room. Like you just can feel it.
Mhm.
And there are times
Yeah.
I will feel it with parents and I'll say, so, I mean, I try to really like lowball it and be really gracious. And do you happen to have any family history for anxiety? And so many of them will say no, because I think they just don't have any idea. But I have gotten to the point that I think for sure, if you are type A at all, if you are perfectionistic, a 1 on the
Yeah.
Enneagram, me too, then that's, I think, what is underneath it. But we didn't know. And so it all funneled into this perfectionism. And so I
Yeah.
think as a parent, be generous with yourself and gracious to yourself in light of we didn't know. And so there's a genetic piece of it that gets rippled over. And then I think we're still parenting out of that deficit. And so
Yeah.
wanting to help parents feels really important to me. Like, not only how do you recognize it in kids, but how do you recognize it in yourself and what can you do to help them?
That's so good. And so, I thought this was interesting. I heard a different interview where you were talking about this, and you talked about how common anxiety is. And I can't remember if you gave a statistic, but can you just speak into that?
Yes. So it was, back last time we talked, it was 1 in 4 kids.
Okay.
Now at this point in the pandemic, we're talking 1 in 3 kids, and girls are twice as likely. And so it really is rampant among kids. And again, I think when the pandemic started, and last time when you and I talked, I was more worried about elementary age girls. And then the pandemic hit and they started doing so much better. And now it's the teenagers that I'm more nervous for. And it's really why I wrote this book. And I found myself on interviews saying I wrote the book in 10 weeks. And then I thought, that sounds ridiculous. Did I really write this book in 10 weeks? But the pandemic hit and I was so worried about them, and we were home. We didn't have anywhere to go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I just started churning this out. And I mean, I really did. From like, I think it was end of April to May is when I wrote this book, because it just felt so like, this is what I want kids to be able to hear
Mhm.
that don't have access to counseling, that aren't necessarily meeting with somebody right now and don't know what's going on with them. And so
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
yes, it is just rampant
so
right now.
good.
And it's bleeding over into depression too.
And you said also, you just said girls are twice as likely than boys. Isn't that what you just said?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And then what did you say? Where did I read that this is high quality prep right here that I did. Sorry, I can't remember the exact number. But what did you say about that girls are twice as likely to have anxiety, but less likely to get treatment than boys?
Exactly. Yes. Boys are more likely to get treatment for anxiety than girls.
Why? Why do we do that to our boys and girls?
I know. Well, I think a couple reasons. One is I think often anxiety, I mean, it can for both genders, but for boys in particular, I think it comes out as anger and it's just more obvious. And for girls, a lot of anxious girls are really successful in the eyes of their world. At school, they're doing really well. They're often leaders in their classes. They're mostly good at home because they're trying to please us. Now, I think those girls, a lot of times the wheels will come off on the way home from school because they've tried to hold it in so much during the school day. But so I think we don't necessarily even realize that's what is underneath that behavior, but it's more fear-based than desire on their part. And so plus I think, and I always want to say this really graciously as well, but I do think moms are typically harder on girls, and their firstborn girls especially. And firstborn girls are the ones most likely to have anxiety. I don't mean because moms are harder on them. I mean just because they're firstborn.
Yeah.
But I think that creates this perfect storm. And especially if I'm an anxious parent, I'm often going to be harder on my daughter. Like, you can figure this out. You can do this, because I don't even like that in myself. And so I'm going to kind of try and squash it down in her. And so sometimes I expect more rather than help her find her way to help.
Yes, yes, that's so good. And as a mom of a firstborn daughter that's a senior in high school, I totally can relate to what you're saying. And so let's just talk. I love how you kind of set this out so simply in the book. You said fear is something you're afraid of, and fear turns into worry when it hangs around more. And then anxiety is when fear or worry gets stuck. And so, will you speak in that a little bit? So, let's just get on the same page, kind of talking about what it is, what fear and anxiety are, and then you can give us some do's and don'ts as parents and what to look for, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So fear, I think, really is, it exists more in the presence of the object we're afraid of, or that we think we're about to encounter the object. So if I'm afraid of a spider, I'm not afraid of a spider right now sitting in my kitchen because I don't see any spiders. I don't think I have any right now. But I lived in a house one time with brown recluse, and I could get scared at any point because I felt like they were everywhere.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
so but it's really about that specific object. Worry is a little bit more pervasive, and we can scare ourselves really with worry, even from a brain chemistry standpoint. So I can get worried about something that might not happen, but the worry passes. Whereas anxiety, I talk about with kids of all ages, is it's like the one loop roller coaster at the fair. And so something pops into my head and I cannot get it out. And we all have intrusive thoughts, thousands of them per day. You know, where we all of a sudden the worst case scenario pops into our head. If we don't have anxiety, the worst case scenario, maybe we think about it for a minute, but we can talk ourselves down. Whereas if I have anxiety, it just loops around and around and I cannot shake it all day long.
Okay, this helps. And so, in a perfect world with our kids, I would think that you would see that it's turned to anxiety because if you have a child that is demonstrative or is actually good at voicing their emotions, if they're emotive, they will probably say, "Hey, they'll keep talking about the same thing," or you can pick up on cues. But then on some kids, that's not how they roll. It's all internal. And I heard you say something about how anger is a secondary emotion. And so, help us know, how do we look for this in our kids, this anxiety, where it's turned from worry to fear to anxiety?
Well, anger is definitely one of the ways one of the ways it manifests itself. And I think, especially in more perfectionistic kids, a lot of times they'll contain it and contain it and contain it. And then all of a sudden it'll erupt. Or with younger kids, I sit with parents all the time who have younger kids who will say, my daughter is really controlling or my son's really manipulative. And what I'll always do is, anger is a secondary emotion, which means there's something underneath it. And so I'll start to say, let's talk about patterns. When do you see the emotion coming? And it's often at times of transition or unpredictability. With older kids, it's times they feel a lot of pressure. And so paying attention to the cues and what's going on underneath it, I think can help us trace back to the origin of where it's coming from.
Okay. And so I think that's where you're so practical when you speak into this, is like kind of the do's and don'ts with parents. And I love that you had said, even this book you wrote, it's kind of like your first 6 counseling sessions or whatever, your first however many counseling sessions to get people kicked off that maybe don't have their kids in some sort of treatment. But you kind of go through some do's and some don'ts. And I'm going to tell you, I was highly offended by one of the don'ts. And you and I could take this up later. It's my go-to is to fix it. And I wouldn't tell you I'm a fix it kind of person because I don't feel like I'm a fix it, because I don't like it when my husband tries to fix my issues when I really want him to let me stay on my loop. But I've seen this with my kids. I've seen it where they, especially my daughter, and she wouldn't mind me saying this, she's somewhere in this house at the moment, actually, but where she is anxious about something and I just want to solve it. And I'm like, well, that's not rational. And here's why that's not rational. And well, you don't have to worry about that because we've already prayed over this. And that's fixing it. And so can you just help us as parents identify the ways that maybe we're getting it wrong when it comes to anxiety? How can we do this better?
Well, I think it really means you're a good parent, Cynthia, because it means you love your daughter and you don't want her to be in distress. Of course, you feel like that. And at the same time, that is the number one complaint I hear from kids about their parents, is they step in and try and fix it. And I think, there are 3 books that I've written at this point about worry. And one is for little girls called Braver, Stronger, Smarter. One's for parents called Raising Worry-Free Girls. And then this one for teenagers, Brave. And in all of them, the definition in the research I did was anxiety is an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of themselves. And so when we either try to fix it, or when we try to rescue them, which I think when they're younger, we try to rescue more. When they're older, we try and fix it. And when we do that, basically we're saying, yep, you're right. You can't do this. I'm going to have to step in and either fix it for you or tell you what you need to do because I don't believe you're capable of figuring it out. Which
Mhm.
is not the message we're intending to give, and it's never the message we would want them to hear, but it's what unintentionally comes across to them. And so I love the idea of empathy and questions. Like, that sounds so hard. What do you want to do about it? What do you think would help? What do you feel like is the right answer? What do you think God would want you to do in this? Because when I ask a question, I'm basically communicating, I believe you're capable of figuring it out.
Mm, mm-mm. Okay. It's so hard. It's so hard. So, not trying to fix it. Give us just point blank some of the things. I mean, based on what you're hearing from kids, it's not helpful. Not helpful to try to fix it. I assume it's not helpful just to give them the canned church answer. Give me just some of the other things, like list them out for us that might be a little slow on the study.
I mean, I think two other, besides fixing it or rescuing, I think two of the other biggest ones are either minimizing it or maybe maximizing it.
Mm,
And minimizing it, you're fine. I mean, I have a situation right now that I'm working with a family that I think the daughter is getting bigger and bigger and bigger because she feels like her parents aren't hearing her.
hmm,
And so we don't want them to do that. So that's where that empathy, I think, is really important. And even basic marriage counseling 101, even if you've never gone, one of the first things they have you do is what I hear you saying is, and it feels so silly to regurgitate what someone just said to you. But if you have been in marriage counseling, it actually works. And so even saying to them, I hear that you're really frustrated, or I hear that you're really concerned about this. Gosh, it sounds like you're very worried. That we're just reflecting back what they're feeling, I think helps them stop that process of getting bigger just so we'll pay attention. So minimizing it is one. And I think, Cynthia, especially in the midst of the pandemic, and especially because it's bleeding over into depression and the suicide rates, there's so much out right now about how the
mhm.
suicide rates are climbing. I think we really don't want to minimize it now, in all seriousness.
Yeah.
That's very concerning to me. But then I also see parents, one of the things that happens when any of us get anxious is our amygdala gets triggered, which means our prefrontal cortex is no longer getting blood, which helps us think rationally and manage our emotions. And if you and I are having a conversation and my amygdala gets triggered, it's really easy for yours to jump on board. And then
Okay.
we have amygdala yelling at amygdala, and nobody's reasonable at all. And so if I get just as worked up as he or she is, and I'm making just as big of a deal, I'm not helping them at all.
Yeah.
I need to, even if I have to step away for a moment and do some breathing techniques, which is one of my first things I always have kids learn to do. Even if I have to do that myself and then re-engage, that's fine. But if I get worked up, they're going to get that much bigger.
Hey friends, jumping in here for just a minute to thank Faithful Counseling for sponsoring our podcast today. I want to read you one of the reviews on Faithful Counseling that I saw online. It says, the counseling has been a total blessing to my life and to the state of my mental health. My counselor is well versed in many methods and practices, yet relies on the Spirit to guide him into the right practice at the right time. This is just one of the many people that are benefiting from the services of Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is secure, online, professional counseling. It's available worldwide. You can log onto your account anytime and send a message to your counselor. You'll receive thoughtful and timely messages, but you can also schedule weekly video or phone sessions. Faithful Counseling is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, so they'll make it easy and free to change counselors if you need to. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling. So go to faithfulcounseling.com/pardonthemess and receive 10% off your first month of counseling. Again, it's faithfulcounseling.com/pardonthemess. Okay, and so you just mentioned one of them, but the things that do work, and as a parent, I heard you say that, be willing to sit in it with them, give them time to answer. Gosh, I'm bad at that too, Sissy, because I don't like blank space. Like, I'm always like, okay, let me fill that in for you. So tell us as parents.
It makes you a great podcaster, but it probably trips you up sometimes as a parent.
Something like that. Sissy, so tell us what as parents, and you've kind of gone over some of this, but tell us what to do as parents, right? And then also, can you, as you're doing that, tell us what we can encourage our kids to be doing that will help them as well?
I love that you're asking both those questions, because if I were meeting, as you're listening, if I were meeting with your child in counseling, I would be pulling you into the session, because I would want you to know the tools that I'm giving your child, because they're not going to remember once they get activated. in terms of their anxiety. So as a parent, I do think for you to help them gradually work their way towards the scary thing, because any of us to work our way through fear, we've got to do the scary thing. And so I'm having a lot of parents reward healthy coping strategies, number one, and number two, reward working their way toward what they're afraid of. So if they're younger, if the child, you cannot get your child out of your bed, have them, next they get on an air mattress on the floor outside of your room, and then they move to the next room over. And every time they do that for 5 nights, you give them a reward. So like that. Now with adolescents, it gets a little bit trickier, and I don't know that it's as much rewarding them along the way, but I think we could space it out more. And hey, that thing that, we have to act so breezy with adolescents, as having them, that thing that you've been wanting to do, like whatever, that speech that you've been afraid of, when you do it, I'm going to take you to your favorite restaurant that night to celebrate. So it's not like I'm going to reward your healthy coping strategies because they would shut down and never talk to us again. No, not really, but
right.
But right. To reward something like that, I think can be in that way, in a sneakier way with adolescents, really helpful. So that would be the main thing I would say with parents. With kids, my top 3 things that I have every child do that I'm meeting with in counseling. The first is breathing. We always want to start there, because until we can calm the amygdala down, we're not going to get anywhere with a child, because they're not in their rational brain. And so the way that I do it is I have them draw a square on their leg, and you breathe a different way with each line of the square, and then pause in the corner for 3 seconds. And there are a million ways kids learn to breathe. That's called square breathing, like I said, but I think there's so many different techniques they can use, but basically 20 seconds of deep breathing resets the amygdala. So we've got to get them slowing down and breathing, just calming down. And that way we can do it. If we're in the car driving to something they're nervous about, we can breathe with them. If you have a teenager, I don't know if they have a smartwatch, but a lot of smartwatches do that. But also there are apps that help with that. Calm is a great app. If you have younger kids, Calm Kids. Headspace is a great app that can help with that. But something that'll slow them down. And that's one of the things I'm having parents reward with little ones. When they see them do that, they get a sticker or something teeny. Yeah. So breathing, and then they're capable of getting out of the loop. So we want to pull them out of the loop with something that is a cognitive behavioral therapy technique called grounding exercises, which basically is anything sensory related. Those are great grounding exercises. So my favorite one is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So if you're, again, if you're driving in the car with your child, they're on their way to school and they're anxious about school. They haven't been in school. It's the first day back after the pandemic. We have some kids in that situation in March here. So tell me 5 things you see. And they look around the car, the window, the rear view mirror, whatever. 5 things they see. 4 things you hear. Tell me 3 things you feel. Tell me 2 things you smell. Tell me 1 thing you taste. And when we're having to engage our senses that way, it really is grounding for us. In effect, it's like grabbing our ankles and pulling us back to the ground. You can also have them do math. I have my teenagers count backwards from 100 by 7s, which requires focus for anyone. Anything that requires that kind of zeroing in. So grounding. And then the last thing I have them do is I want them always to name their worry. And in the little girl's book, I called it the worry monster. And in the teenage book, I call it the worry whisper, because that's what it feels like. There's this voice in the back of our head whispering these things to us, like, you can't do it. You're the only one who's ever felt this way. Something's wrong with you, all these things. And so to name that voice, and with teenagers, we joke around about it a lot in my group counseling sessions. They'll come up with these hilarious names like Agnes or whatever. And they'll say, Agnes has been bothering me. And when they can do that, it takes away some of the power. And so not only does it do that, but they can say, Agnes, I'm not listening to you anymore. You're not the boss of me. You have no power over me. Shut up. You're stupid, whatever they want to say, even language they wouldn't necessarily use to another person. But I think they can talk back to it too. And I think that's always a really helpful tool.
Oh, those are so good. They're so good for adults too. I think for any of us, that's so helpful. So how do we know when, this is probably a hard question to answer, but how do we know when it's somebody, especially in a pandemic, but if our kids just kind of seasonally dealing with something versus like we may have more of a chronic issue and we need to get help? How do we know kind of how to look at that and when to actually go and seek help versus maybe trying to do some techniques at home? And I think as a parent, sometimes we worry about like, and this is why I think it falls under brave conversations, but I don't want to plant the seed that there's, we've labeled this child with anxiety now because I'm going to get them help. And so, we kind of want to blow it off, or maybe not just me, but we just kind of want to, in some regards, want to act like it's not there as opposed to making it a big thing. And obviously that's not the right tactic either. So how do we know?
That's such a great question. And I would say, again, because of where things are going with the pandemic, I would err on the side of caution right now. But I think, even the things we've talked about today, or if you get one of those 3 books, practice those things for a couple months. That's what I tell parents all the time. Do them for a couple months. If it feels like it makes no difference, then that's when I would say you want to take them to see a counselor. But I think outside of that, if you feel like it's moving into depression, if you can tell their baseline level of happiness is dropping, that if they're spending more time in their room, if they're sullen more, if their eating habits change, any of those things, especially if they're talking about something like not wanting to be here anymore. I think in those situations, take them straight to a counselor. Don't wait those couple of months. Obviously, if your child's talking about, I want to take my own life, take them straight to the hospital, not even the counselor.
Yeah.
But I think those kind of things, or if it's making them physically sick enough, we have kids that throw up as a result of their anxiety regularly. I think in those times that child needs to probably go straight to a counselor. Or if you feel like you've already done some of these things, maybe even instinctively, and it hadn't made a difference. But anxiety is very much related to temperament. It is always, every child I ever sit with who is anxious is really conscientious. They try hard. They care deeply. They're like the coolest kids and the coolest grownups. And so often what we'll see is it recurs. I'll see this pattern with families where a child will have a lot of separation anxiety. And right about the time the parent thinks, maybe we need to go see somebody, it goes away. And then it pops back up a couple years later as something else. And I would say if you're noticing a recurring pattern like that, it could be good to go ahead and do something too.
Well, and I'm going to read, you reference this quote, but I'm going to read this from your book, because if you buy the book for no other reason, you need to buy it to talk to your kids about this. I love where you say, all of the girls I've met, and I'm going to say kids, boys and girls, but all the girls I've ever met who are anxious have a few things in common. They're bright and conscientious. They care and feel deeply, and they try hard. Those very gifts are sometimes the things that make us more anxious. It can be hard to turn down the volume knob on all of the caring and awareing. And I think that's just such a beautiful way to even start these hard, brave conversations. Maybe they're not hard conversations in your house, but to be able to say, like, this is coming from a good place, kid, and I love you for this, and let's get a handle on it. And so as we wrap up, and by the way, I'm real sad to wrap up because I could spend all day. I kind of want to move in with you, but I won't. Can you just briefly tell us I know you mentioned obviously suicide rates, the numbers seem to be increased right now. Are there other things you're seeing, mental health things like eating disorders, other things that are up as well that we should keep our eye on for our kids?
I don't know the statistics, big picture on eating disorders, but I will say in my own practice with kids, I'm seeing those on the rise in a way that I haven't in probably 12 years. And I think, if you think about that, eating disorders are about self-hatred and they're about control, are two of the things that I think feed them the most. Right now, all of us have been eating more in the pandemic, sometimes because we were stuck at home, but sometimes for a sense of comfort. We've all been doing that, and we've felt out of control. And so, of course, kids are struggling in that way. So I do think that's something that is on the rise, in as well as the depression and the suicide rates. Those are probably the primary things.
Just give us, if you could sit down with every parent that's listening to this that's worried about a kid with some anxiety, if you could give them one word, what would that be? What would be your best encouragement for them?
Well, I think my best encouragement would be, don't be afraid to get help. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask for help for yourself. If you've been listening and you feel like, wow, I think I've had anxiety for 20 years and I never knew I had it. And I think what I want to say to every parent right now anyway is give yourself a whole lot of grace. I have never had as many parents, Cynthia, in my office in tears and who feel more shame about the fact that they're messing up right now. And so I think you have got to give yourself a whole lot of room and a whole lot of grace. And I think what we want to be saying to kids is, you've got this. And we need to be saying the same thing to ourselves. Like, you're going to make
Yeah.
it. You're doing great.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. All right. Well, the book is Brave, a teenage girl's guide to beating worry and anxiety. And then Sissy, you have the other two books. And I'll link them all on podcasts. Do you have other resources you like to point people to?
Yes. So raisingboysandgirls.com is our website. And then I'm trying to, like, I put out something on Instagram last night about how to help kids fall asleep. On my own Instagram, I'm trying to put out as much as I possibly can about this time and how to help kids. And it's just Sissy Goff.
Sissy Goff. Okay. Awesome. Good to see you, friend. Thank you.
You too. Yeah, I'm always so glad to get to spend time with you.
All right. I know you love Sissy as much as I do. And be sure and get her book, Brave, A Teen Girl's Guide to Beating Worry and Anxiety. It's really good and it's really practical. It's a workbook for your girls. And so I think it is well worth ordering and getting to those kids that are struggling with anxiety. I'm so thankful for you guys for joining me today. We're going to continue the next couple weeks talking about hard conversations we need to have with our kids. We know your days are busy. So as always, thank you for joining us as we pardon the mess.